back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I am your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, we're returning to a director that neither of us have a whole lot of experience with, but we have talked about before on this podcast. That's right, we're back with more David Lynch. Previously, we had talked about Eraserhead. I have some experience. I've watched a little bit of Twin Peaks. I actually, it turns out I've watched like a season and a half of Twin Peaks. I was going through my Netflix queue. I thought I had seen like 4 episodes. Watched a lot more than I thought. Twin Peaks is a hell of a drug, y'all. What's your familiarity with David Lynch before we get too far into this?
I'm fairly certain the only Lynch thing I've seen is Eraserhead. However, it is worth noting that as I watch more David Lynch, the more I discover that all of my favorite artists are frauds who just take from David Lynch with reckless abandon. This time, since we're talking about Blue Velvet, I had a moment where, so that, not like a big spoiler, but that song they play a couple times, a candy-colored clown they call the Sandman, that one?
Yeah.
That's featured prominently in Alan Wake.
Okay. To be fair, Alan Wake is so heavily inspired by David Lynch anyway that is not a big deal. Like,
no,
you knew.
It's not like, it's not a big deal, but like because I knew going in that I knew after a while that Alan Wake was heavily inspired by Twin Peaks, which I still need to watch because every fucking thing I like is inspired by Twin Peaks. But it's just like one of those things. Like when I heard that song at Alan Wake, I'm like, this is a quirky, old timey kind of song to use in this instance. And I'm like, oh, that's why they use.
Yeah, see, I thought you were going to be like, I discovered it's in a Tarantino or Kojima or somebody's, and you're like, oh, Alan Wake. I'm like, well, of course it's in Alan Wake.
Well, no, of course it's Alan Wake. I mean, I'm sure that Kojima in particular, if I wanted to, do the deep dive, I'm sure he is a man who is fond of his David Lynch. But I had a bit of an out of body experience when that song started playing, especially because it's used so prominently here.
Yeah, there's 2 or 3 songs in this movie, and they are all just front and center the entire time that they're playing. But before we dive too far into that, we should talk a little bit about our experiences with the movie. So I'll let you continue to talk, Jackson. What'd you think of Blue Velvet?
Sure, and I guess I should clarify. I don't remember what exactly I said about Eraserhead in the episode. Whatever I said, I've only come to appreciate it more over time. It's one of those movies that occasionally I just think about, which, as I've said a couple times, is always a good thing when it sticks with me in a way that doesn't make me seethe with rage. That can happen too. But so I like Eraserhead quite a bit. So Blue Velvet, my feelings generally speaking was that in terms of narrative, it was surprisingly conventional as far as like a crime mystery noir sort of thing goes, but as far as the filmmaking and visuals, I was completely spellbound by the style. So did I like it? I don't know. Did it have my attention the entire time? Almost certainly. So yeah, I didn't walk away from this one really loving it. I don't think I'll be coming back to this one in the way that I would come back to something like Eraserhead, but it was definitely worth the watch. It was I'm glad that we've chosen to plumb the depths of David Lynch further. I think it's a valuable, fruitful thing, which is always nice.
Yeah, much as Jackson was saying, my experience with David Lynch is that he's a little bit of a weirder dude when it comes to his films. As I watched quite a bit of Twin Peaks, apparently. Eraserhead I've had experience with. I should mention I also watched his weird experimental monkey movie that dropped on Netflix, that short. That was utterly incomprehensible. It was fascinating, but it was definitely incomprehensible. And on top of all that, I mentioned before that I do audio editing for 25 years later, and I do a lot of editing of people's Twin Peaks pieces, which sounds like the most batshit thing in the world. Twin Peaks, I cannot even begin to comprehend what these people are talking about. They're clearly seeing things in the show that are incredibly deep and fascinating and introspective, and they're good pieces. I'm not knocking the people who write these things. I am knocking the fact that this show is insane.
I imagine the effect is quite like reading a very well thought out, very substantial analysis of Metal Gear Solid.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So, like, not knocking the writers, absolutely not. They're wonderful people. But when I go into Blue Velvet, then I'm expecting something utterly insane. And Jackson is right, is that it is a very conventional kind of cop thriller. There's definitely some unconventionality to it, which we'll talk about more later for sure. But surface level, it is bad thing happens, person comes in, tries to solve bad thing. That's all there is to it. There's not some weird alien baby. There's not some pseudo afterlife lodge stuff going on. It's just bad people doing bad things. Good people gotta come in and solve it. And there's lots of sex. So I was very much not prepared for that when I went into it. Leaving the movie, I feel also very similar to Jackson in that I have no idea how I felt about this movie. I can safely say that I didn't dislike it. I
See, because you were about to say enjoy. That feels like the wrong word.
It does. That's why I stopped myself. I paid attention to the movie. I don't really know how to phrase this in a way in which I'm not just repeating what Jackson has said verbatim, because I, surface level, feel the exact same way that Jackson does. It was fascinating to watch. I don't know that I'm going to go back and watch it again for reasons that I'm going to get into a bit more later, because a little bit of a tease. I think that there's a modern movie that does a very similar aesthetic, but a little bit better. So I leave it glad I saw it. Just fucking gonna plagiarize Jackson's whole thing. I'm happy I saw it. I don't know that I'm gonna watch it again. It was a weird fucking movie. And I don't know what the hell else to say about it in this review of what we thought of the film.
So I have two surface level things before we go like floor the gas into Crazy Town and spoilers. The first is that the Amazon description described this as a sensual thriller. And I'm like, man, oh man, is that like not the word I want associated with anything, with any of the sex stuff in this movie? Holy shit. Like, what is wrong with the person writing that copy?
No, you don't understand. Blue Velvet's supposed to be a sexy film. You're not supposed to be feeling a mixture of revulsion and confusion the entire time that you're watching it. You're supposed to be just rock fucking hard and ready to go, baby.
just whipping it out. Dicks out for Dennis Hopper.
I mean, it is effective in that, like, there are moments where you're like, okay, I see how this is sexy, but you are also still just constantly no.
Well, don't misunderstand. It's not a knock against the movie. It's a knock against whoever wrote that fucking copy.
It's insane. Yeah, no, that's an absurd way to describe Blue Velvet.
Yeah, and then the other thing, speaking of dicks out for Dennis Hopper, is just that, what a fucking lunatic. Like, I can't believe, especially because I didn't do a ton of reading on this one. I just, just skimmed some of the, like, information pages and, like, Wikipedia articles and some stuff. And, like, this is apparently the movie that, like, after Dennis Hopper, like, cocained himself into, like, Hollywood jail, this is the movie that resurrected his career. Who looked at this man screaming, "Kermie wants his Milkies," and decided that he would be the perfect fit to play Donald Trump Bowser? Who decided this and why? I love them for it.
This is, as an aside, apparently going to be this podcast year of Dennis Hopper, because we just kind of keep stumbling into Dennis Hopper movies. We didn't really intend to, like, we've seen 3 of them now this year, which isn't a lot, but he is like the one actor that just keeps showing up in these films.
Like I just couldn't look at his face without thinking of fucking Bowser. This is the man they got to play Bowser. Why?
No spoilers. At the end of the movie, there's a very tense scene involving Dennis Hopper. And Sam had not been watching this with me at all. She comes down and looks at it, and I just go, "That's Bowser." And she's just like, "What the fuck?" and walks away.
This isn't much of a spoiler, but my favorite thing that I did read is that, so throughout the movie, one of his character's tics is that he like has this oxygen mask that he like puts on, and it's some sort of drug.
Nitrous oxide is what I read, for what it's worth.
Yeah. Well, because what I read is that in the original script, Lynch had intended for it to be helium, but then Dennis Hopper walked up and he's like, "David Lynch, listen, man, I love you, but when it comes to drugs, you don't know shit about drugs. I, Dennis Hopper, know everything about drugs, and I know exactly what Frank Fontaine is huffing in these scenes."
But let me give you a counterpoint here. The initial scene where we meet Frank with helium.
It would have been delightful. It would have been delightful.
It would have been so good and worked so well with that high-pitched voice. I absolutely yes. I see why he wanted helium for those scenes.
No, I totally see it too. I'm not knocking David Lynch here, but I just love that, like, this is why I can't, like, in every role that he's in, I don't see a character. Well, I see Bowser, but more than Bowser, I see Dennis Hopper. I see a man completely untethered.
Well, before we dive fully into spoilers, I kind of want to talk a little bit about what I hinted at earlier, which is to say a modern kind of parallel to this movie, because I think this is a good primer for what we're going to be talking about, as well as a way for me to gush about my favorite movie of last year some more, because I will never stop until the world watches this movie. So, for those unfamiliar with what this whole Blue Velvet thing is about, the just elevator pitch of it is good old boy comes home in the 1950s, meets up with just a neat old girl, just like having a grand old time, finds an ear in the middle of a field, takes it to the police, and suddenly gets wrapped up in a very dark, weird, kind of bloody, bizarre, abusive, sexual assaulting horror story of an underground society living in his town. So it's very much kind of one of those movies where it's like, look at the shine, the beginning is super brightly lit, there's some glint, almost dreamlike lighting across the whole thing, before it digs into a shot of beetles doing whatever the fuck beetles are doing under the ground.
I'm gonna assume they're reproducing. I don't know if that's true, but like I can't imagine it being anything else given the content of the movie.
Yeah, that it looks like that. I didn't want to say that for sure because I wasn't positive, but yes, I would also agree that they are probably getting down with that beetle loving.
I'll take the bullet if we're wrong on this one, Sean. I'm the one who put the chips in the beetle loving box.
So that's the basic short and skinny of what Blue Velvet is. It's a very hard to explain movie without getting really into spoilers. The modern counterpoint I would like to compare it to, and the modern kind of sister film, if not updated film, is Greener Grass. If you're a longtime listener of this podcast, you know that I talk about Greener Grass semi-frequently. I absolutely adore that movie. It's utterly fucking off the wall. It is bizarre. It's hard, almost harder to explain than fucking Blue Velvet is, but it does have that same idea of just an idyllic American suburbia with weird underlying nightmare stuff. And where Blue Velvet was a 1986 film that was like, oh, look, the 1950s aren't as great as you remember. Here's this 30-year nostalgia cycle, and we're going to break it down and show you that it was all terrible and bad. And, Lynch grew up in the 50s, and so it might be that juxtaposition of his growing up in seeing terrible things as the counterpoint to movies like The Blob and stuff, where the good old boy just comes in and saves the town and things aren't terrible. Don't you worry about it, young lady. Wasn't super shocking in the 80s, honestly. Even in 1986, people were like, yeah, we know. What do you want to do with that? Which I would argue isn't necessarily the point of the movie. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But where it is just kind of shining a light on, look, American suburbia isn't great. Greener Grass kind of takes that and goes, look, American suburbia even looks great today, but let's talk about what's going on underneath it without reframing it into some weird, dirty sex romp, and just kind of dig at a little bit of the racism and weird keeping up with the Joneses going on and the weird. I have a lot to say about Greener Grass that I cannot get into right now because it will take up the rest of the podcast. But to suffice it to say, I do think that Greener Grass does a lot of what Blue Velvet was trying to do and was doing. I say trying, but it was successfully really exploring these ideas and themes. I just think that Greener Grass is kind of a modern updating of it. And so me being of the age where it would hit harder, I think it just connected with me in a better way, and I think is more resonant with today's audiences, especially given that if this was not shocking in 1986 that, oh no, American suburbia has a seedy underbelly, y'all, it's 2020. The world's on fucking fire. You better believe that we know that the world has a seedy underbelly at this point.
Because the thing about the seedy underbelly in this movie, I agree with pretty much everything you're saying, except I haven't seen Greener Grass. But it's funny because I will. I promise I'll watch it.
It's on Hulu. Just as an aside to everyone, Greener Grass is on Hulu. If you have Hulu, please watch it.
As another aside, I want to remind our dear listeners that Sean sold this movie to me as too many cooks, but you don't want to kill yourself by the end, and that's still the greatest endorsement of a movie I've ever heard.
It's very, very good.
I agree with pretty much everything that Sean's saying. It's actually really interesting because I had just gotten done editing the final draft of my novel, which is not really similar to Blue Velvet in any substantial way, but as far as that, looking at the small town Americana
and also the fact that you do have Dennis Hopper written into the book as a character helping nitrous oxide. Other than that, though, it's purely superficial.
Dennis Hopper does feature prominently in my novel, my young adult novel aimed at teenagers. Famous actor Dennis Hopper, star of Easy Rider and the Super Mario Brothers movie.
He's also in Waterworld. We can't forget about Waterworld.
We cannot forget about Waterworld, as much as Dennis Hopper might want us to. God rest his soul. So it's actually kind of funny that I was thinking about, because that's obviously a theme that I've seen before and that resonates with me pretty strongly. It resonates with me strongly enough to include that kind of subtext in my own work. I think that the thing that kept me from really, really connecting with the movie and more just appreciating it and appreciating the artistry of it was just that when I see, because it's an interesting point that you bring up. I think we tend to default to, back however long ago, this was probably more shocking, which is true, in some cases is true to a degree, but we often don't give previous moviegoers enough credit sometimes. That was another criticism of the best example is actually the Christopher Reeve Superman movie. Today, it's seen as old fashioned and corny and hokey. Even the modern DC movies kind of poke fun at it. But even back then, the idea of Superman in the 70s, that's written into the text of the film that Superman is a corny character and kind of out of place in the modern setting of 1970 whatever. I think there is a sense that I was even doing while I was watching this, of like, not giving the past enough credit for recognizing things, basically. But ultimately, I think that what kept me from identifying or relating with the movie or really internalizing it so much is that the form that the seediness takes is very much like, not quite like mafioso, like Godfather, but like on that track, like that kind of gangster drug dealer world that, when we're talking about the seedy underbelly, I think there's something to what you're saying about like greener grass, and that when we think about the problems with suburbia, it is not Dennis Hopper huffing nitrous oxide and screaming Kermie wants his Milkies, and I think that that's a valid point of view, and that's a valid, interpretation of like looking back on like some of the seedier stuff in the 50s. But it's almost, for as far as like my experience as a viewer, it's almost too overt. You know what I mean?
It's very, how much worse could it be than this? There's a fucking police shootout at one point in this movie. Look at how bad things have gotten. And like, I mean, kind of, but also,
I mean, that's not great. You're right.
Yeah. Maybe this was happening in the 50s, but I mean, I think part of it too is, and this is where I think that a lot of the audience, and even to what we're saying here, isn't giving Lynch enough credit, because I think that he knew that everything about this movie was a little over the top. I mean, a little over the top. Yeah, that was the understatement of the fucking century. But I mean, Lynch, I saw at one point somebody say that Lynch is more about a feeling than anything else. And this movie does a very good job at evoking feelings. And the feeling might be, hey, the 50s weren't as idyllic as we wanted them to believe. And sure, that might be something that we all know at this point. But at the same time, it's just something, when it's a movie based around that 30-year nostalgia cycle, it doesn't hurt to get kicked in the groin once again and go, hey, maybe we shouldn't idolize the past. It's not as good as we remember.
Yeah, and that's super interesting. Like we were talking about in the pre-discussion, and I just wanted to bring it up here, that like I wonder, now that we're on kind of the tail end of the 80s nostalgia stuff, and we're starting to move into more of the 90s nostalgia stuff that's coming closer to like when we were actually kids. I'm wondering, because inevitably there's going to be movies like examining 90s like Clinton era culture that we grew up with, that has such a reputation of being like a safe time, like a good time. Like this is the time they made Fight Club, and Fight Club can only exist when there is like middle class white boy angst and no other problems, even though there obviously were other problems and there were going to be movies about those problems. And I think I'm wondering, like, just from my own perspective, and this is not something anyone can really answer until it happens, but I'm curious to see how this will play out. Like, will those movies kind of tearing down 90s nostalgia, will they hit harder because like that is the shit that we had, like that is us, or like have I seen so much and like intellectualized this sort of theme to such a degree that even that will not have as the intended impression upon me? I don't know, but I think it's an interesting little thought to entertain.
On that topic, two things. First of all, book recommendation. Go read Best Movie Year Ever. It's all about 1999 and like the movies that came out that year and whatever all of them were, because there's a lot of movies that he talks about in which some of them are great, some of them are terrible, but they all really shaped that year, and like it was a very weird, transformative year. Great read, very much recommended. But also, I'm curious to see whether the 90s even hits us really at all, because I feel like our nostalgia is going to be more for like early 2000s rather than the 90s as much, because I feel like it's going to be focused way...
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be focused way more on like 95, and I mean, I was 2, you were 1 at the time. I don't fucking remember that shit. Are you kidding me?
No, yeah, you're right. Like, it's funny because, like, in a lot of the memes about, like, hey, like, 90s kids, like, there's a lot of stuff a lot of tangible things that like we grew up with that existed when we were like conscious. But no, I mean, you're absolutely right. We were, generally speaking, more early aughts kids, which was not known as a peaceful time. So
it'll be interesting to see where that goes. That was a segue before we get into spoilers, because I assume we're ready to get into spoilers.
Yeah, I think we're brushing up against the walls of this madness. So let's hit the gas. Let's go. Bad Choice Road, baby.
Well, before we slam on that gas as hard as we possibly can, we do need to take a minute to say, if you're enjoying the podcast, leave us a review on iTunes, follow us on Twitter at BADH_cast, support us on Patreon, patreon.com/BADHcast. Next week, we're actually going to be off. We're going to be taking 2 weeks off. We'll be back around mid-August is the plan. We'll let you know if any of that changes, but we're going to be coming back with an anime called Parasite the Maxim, which is one of my all-time favorites. That's right. This is an anime that I'm bringing to the table.
Damn, Shauna introduced me to this one. This is the shit. This is the legit shit.
So get ready for that. That's going to be in 2 weeks, or 3 weeks technically, because we're taking 2 weeks off. We apologize for that. We are still going to be releasing our bonus episode tomorrow from when this comes out, or maybe the day after, depending on how much I can cram through the editing. But don't worry, we're not dropping that. Stay tuned. We just need a little bit of a break to recharge. We've been at this for a long time, and if you haven't noticed, we've been staring into the void a lot recently, and we kind of just need a break from doing that.
Sometimes you just need to sit back. You need to relax. You need to forget about the fact the world's on fire and not talk about movies about how the world's on fire and always has been on fire and always will be on fire. So
I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks just watching utter garbage and rotting my brain with bad movies. I saw Fant Four Stick last week. That was terrible. We should not talk about Fant Four Stick. We should talk about this. So let's fucking huff some nitrous oxide, slam on that gas, and let's get talking about spoilers.
Kermies Milkies. I just want to keep saying that.
And audience, I don't know what he's talking about either. He has said this to me for like the past 3 weeks, and I still don't understand. Don't worry.
It's a wretched meme you don't want to understand.
Where do we want to start with spoilers? How do we want to break into this?
I mean, do we want to go with the heavy stuff first? Because I got something to say about the sexual assault stuff. Oops.
Yeah, let's start there. Hey, Editor Sean here. Just a quick content warning. If it's not already clear, we're going to be talking a bit about sexual assault in this episode. It's all fairly surface level stuff, but I figured I should give you all a heads up. Back to you, Jackson.
Yeah, so there's a lot of sexual assault in this movie. This is to a degree, I would say, a movie about sexual abuse and sexual assault.
I mean, sex is power, really. Like, that's what I was thinking about a lot. Like, this movie also has a lot of violence begets violence and sexual abuse begets sexual abuse. And it's also just a lot about power. I'm going to let Jackson talk. I just wanted to slide that in there to get that in your brain, because I'm going to come back to that.
Yeah. And so one thing about this movie, and this was maybe like, this was maybe a little bit of dissonance, but like a prominent part of the movie, and like I overstated in the pre-discussion, making it sound like I thought that like Dennis Hopper was supposed to be the liquid snake to fucking Kyle MacLachlan's Solid Snake, like some dark shadow of the self, which is clearly not true. Dennis Hopper is Dennis Hopper. There is no solid Hopper. There only is Dennis Hopper. But there is a moment where I think we're meant to feel like the protagonist, and perhaps by extension the audience, kind of sees a bit of themselves, a bit of that like dark shadow of the self in Dennis Hopper when Kyle MacLachlan's character from the closet, after getting caught snooping around Isabella Rossellini's apartment, and he gets caught and they have an encounter. She stabs him in the face with a knife and then has like a, there's some weird like sexual tension there. She asks him to strip, weird fucked up stuff going on. She shoves him in the closet. Dennis Hopper arrives, does the memes we've been talking about. And I say the memes, and what I actually mean is like a horrible sexual assault scene with Dennis Hopper screaming like a madman. Very uncomfortable. Don't recommend. This
is the first time that this happens in the movie. And like up to this point, it has felt like a weird movie, but not not this. It is so jarring.
Yeah, and to the movie's credit, I like that definitely feels intentional.
Oh, yeah.
It works really well as like something that's genuinely very shocking. And not just like edgy postal shocking, for its own sake. But after this, we get this display, and there's, like you were saying with the sexist power thing, the Dennis Hopper has like two personas, I guess. I hate that word in this context. And I feel like the Ben Shapiro meme where he talks about like that say for the sake of argument that you're like daddy's little whatever, that fucking meme, the one. But so he's got two personas. He's got daddy and he's got baby. Let's just fucking say it and get it over with. And so he witnesses both of these. And then Dennis Hopper leaves, and it's either, I can't remember the exact order. I think it's in a later scene where finally Kyle MacLachlan's character gives in. He's having sex with Isabella Rossellini's character. She's like, hurt me more, Snake. And he does. And he has this moment of like, oh my God, like I am just like Dennis Hopper in this moment is sort of the implication. And he's like crying and having a breakdown. And it is, if I do have to say, like, if we're talking past dissonance versus like modern dissonance, just with how much more like open people are with their kinks, like people declaring what they're into and like their Twitter profiles, having a breakdown over him like being asked to like smack her in the face. Well, obviously that connects to the themes of power and sexual assault, because there is like a fucked up power dynamic there in a lot of ways that, we can go into if we want. But
I don't know that either of us are prepared to.
I was gonna say, I don't know if we want is the key word.
Yeah, we'll leave it out there in the ether. There are other things we can discuss, and I'm not prepared for that today.
Just what's important right now is there is a fucked up power dynamic along many like latitudes and longitudes here. But just from like a shocking moment, this is one moment where I feel like the absolute freedom of expression of modern society like takes the punch out of that comparison a little bit, just because like I see people saying "hurt me more, daddy" on their Twitter profiles like every day when I'm in line at the grocery store at this point, which is maybe says something interesting and fucked up about like our own culture of like sexuality. But also at the same time, as a modern viewer, I'm like, well, I mean, if someone wants to get smacked around consensually, I mean, that's, you do you, queen, chase your bliss. I guess what I'm trying to say is that like in a movie where there is a lot of stuff that's genuinely shocking, and this sort of feels like it's supposed to be in that vein, in comparison to like modern movies and just modern culture, it maybe leaves a little bit of dissonance. Not that it takes away from those themes of like power and sex, but like if we're talking about just sort of the small things that maybe kept me from really getting into the movie as a viewer and like fully embracing it, that might be something that I point to, especially because in other senses, when the I really like this is like a character trait, like a theme that I'm sort of fond of. I mean, we were talking about Rear Window just recently, and this is very much like that in this regard, that the character at one point, Laura Dern's character asks like, oh man, are you like a detective or are you just some sort of pervert? And like we see that play out very uncomfortably. Like at first it's not that much of a consideration, but you're really wondering about that afterwards. And so is the character. And I think that works really well.
I mean, I think part of the whole dynamic there, even obviously we weren't around in the 80s, let alone the 50s. So like the whole dynamic of kind of an S&M kinky smack me while we're having sex thing might have been more at play back then. We don't have that information. I think what about it still works today, though, is that clearly Kyle MacLachlan in this scene views himself as a good boy still. So yeah. The smack might not even be as much about like the debauchery of it all as much as it is just about like, this is my vestiges of that good boyness going away. Like that's something that I could see people wrestling with even today. Like if they have this identity of, oh, I'm such a good boy, I would never hit another person. And then, they find a romantic partner that wants to be smacked. that can lead to some really powerful cognitive dissonance within their own minds. So I think that there is still a layer of, oh God, what have I done? Is this okay? Am I okay? Am I still a good boy? Or am I as bad as Dennis Hopper? And you never want to be Dennis Hopper.
You never want to go full Hopper, dude.
And I think that's just something that, like, while I haven't experienced this exact situation in my own life, growing up, I was way more obsessed with being the good boy, the person who really didn't do anything wrong. I mean, I certainly had my moments growing up, but like
we were straight edge kids. We both were.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, like, for me, I think this still resonated just because I saw my own self in Kyle MacLachlan in this moment, where I'm like, oh God, who am I anymore? What is going on? What is life? What is death? Am I bad? So I think it still lands, if not from the shocking sadomasochism of it all, then from just the personal cognitive dissonance schism that occurs as a result.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I think it bears repeating that, you know, who am I to question David Lynch? Nobody. Two, my reaction to the movie, and like if it sounds like, you know, I'm maybe being too nitpicky or criticizing, I do want to stress that I do think Lynch knows what he's doing. I think that the movie is very well made and very interesting. This is more perhaps me attempting to explain the ways in which, like, my personal, like, emotional reaction didn't quite gel, even if I can appreciate the artistry behind it, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think that's really what this episode is for us, because I don't know that this movie is as thematically dense as something like Eraserhead, where we could spend a long time debating the merits of fatherhood and how that manifests within the film. Like, this feels far more upfront with what it's trying to say. And so I think the question much more for us is, why didn't it connect when we can't really point to any one particular spot as that's why I didn't love this movie? Because there's just a lot of weird little moments where you're like, do I like this? I don't know. Is it well done? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, part of it for me, like, speaking only for myself, like, Lynch just might be too big brain for me, like, frankly, and that's fine. Like, not everyone vibes 100% with the director's, like, individual style. I'm definitely a guy who likes his. Well, you know, I say this, but I also acknowledge at the beginning, like I was about to say, I definitely vibe more with something more like a Hitchcock or a Tarantino, where the story is more straightforward and there's just, you know, a lot of stuff going on. I say that, but like in comparison to the other Lynch film that I've seen, I far preferred Eraserhead, which was way more incomprehensible. So
again, I think a lot of this just has to do with the fact that Lynch is way more about creating a feeling than like something super narratively dense. And I mean, even in Eraserhead, a film that is, you know, rife with themes and imagery and motifs, it's still way more about just general anxiety and confusion and misunderstanding. And like, that is a lot of what this movie exudes as well, where it's just a lot of, I'm a great good boy and here I am out with this woman who I love and respect, and she's just, you know, I just think she's neat. And the darker, seedy, grittier underbelly of him being like, oh God, is this truly who I am? Who am I? Am I a detective or am I a pervert? What is my life? Who is anything? God damn it, I'm staring into the void again. Fuck.
Well, before we stare too deeply, I actually have a question along those lines. This might be, you might be able to sell me on this one because I don't know how you feel, but this might be my one genuine, like, capital C criticism of the movie. Did you feel like Laura Dern's character forgave him too easily?
Oh my God, yes, absolutely.
Okay, because that was the one thing. I think it goes along with what you're saying, like the good boy feeling. I feel like that would have had more consequences if the girl next door was actually like, oh my God, like, you're actually really fucked up, you know, like you're too far gone for me, kid. If there were more consequences to that, as opposed to, all right, you're involved in this weird like S&M like abuse thing, but you know, I'm still going along with you. So.
Oh, Jesus Christ. God, when you said that, I got fucking flashes to fucking... All right, buckle up, y'all. We're going to talk a little bit here about sexual power dynamics. But...
Yeah!
But we're going to talk about it in the context of 50 Shades of Grey.
Oh, no!
And before you ask, am I qualified to talk about that? I have watched all of Dan Olsen's videos multiple times on 50 Shades, which does not make me an expert, but I have also seen all of the movies. I, in fact, own 50 Shades Freed.
No! Go off, King. I'm thrilled to hear this next part.
The point that I want to make more than anything is just how similar of a comparison can be made between our leads in this and our leads in 50 Shades as a whole. Not in the same... No, in a very similar way. This is in case you're not picking up on it, dear listener, this is something that I'm formulating off the cuff, so bear with me. And please tweet any indiscretions at me, and there's going to be a lot of them because they're talking about sex. Hey-oh! Ah! So Christian Grey, Christian Grey and Anastasia Steele are our main characters of 50 Shades.
I'm sorry, every time I hear their name...
You know what I think is the most shameful part?
What?
Is that we struggle with character names every week on this podcast. And I pulled that out of my ass. I didn't pause. I didn't look that up. I knew that.
That shit was ingrained. That shit was etched into the stone tablets of your mind.
It's very much, though, in that their relationship is kind of similar to our Kyle MacLachlan and Isabel Rossellini. We're talking about them, and it's gone. What the fuck is wrong with me? I am a broken person. So, in Blue Velvet, Kyle MacLachlan falls into the S&M lifestyle and basically kind of is treated as such because it is just sexual abuse leads people to this lifestyle, which is a very, first of all, damaging view of the S&M lifestyle. Like, that is something that just needs to be addressed here and now. That is not how S&M works. You do not need to have been sexually abused to be into it, and to make that comparison is not great by any stretch of the imagination. But I mean, that's kind of how it happens in this movie, or at least that's kind of like the subtle implications therein. It's not so subtle in 50 Shades, where Christian Grey is literally assaulted by a woman. Comparison there, is led into the S&M lifestyle. Comparison there, and is then rescued by a separate woman who needs to pull him out, and maybe they'll dabble in a little bit, but it won't be as rough, it won't be as bad, don't you worry, she'll forgive him for everything. There's a lot of weird comparisons in that regard, which I think just leads me to the point of neither of these movies do a whole lot of good by the S&M community, which I'm not a member of. I don't know a whole lot about. I just know what I know from Dan Olsen's video, and he did a lot of research into it. And so the comparisons are kind of troubling in a couple ways, just because it raises some unfortunate questions about that lifestyle that shouldn't need to be raised. And also just like we need a woman to save us from this horrible existence of being into S&M, and someone needs to come and pull us out. Otherwise, who knows where we're gonna end up? Oh no.
That is pretty yikes. And I didn't I knew 50 Shades was yikes, but I didn't know the particulars as much. Like, I didn't know anything that happened in like the story proper. So hearing you describe that just took me on like a fucking journey.
Oh man, I glossed over a lot too. That's the
sure
thing.
You did.
I didn't even mention the helicopter crash, which gets resolved 30 seconds later.
Oh. No, I mean it sounds like a really strong comparison though, and I think that to Blue Velvet's credit, I think there is that, like you say, there is an implicit connection. It's not so explicit. I don't know if the intent would be like besmirched, like Isabella Rossellini never like asks him to put on like a gimp suit or anything like that, or any sort of like iconography that we would stereotypically associate with like S&M. But I think you're absolutely on the ball in that it shares a similar kind of uncomfortable undercurrent. And I think that the fact that he is ultimately, like you say, ultimately saved, you know, finger quotes, by Laura Dern's character, I think that's the like that's kind of the thing, the nail in the coffin in this regard, because when throughout the movie, like, I was willing to buy and go along with that Laura Dern's kind of flirting with disaster, that she knows that like Kyle MacLachlan is getting involved in like some really fucked up shit.
God damn it. The more you talk, the more I realize that there's so many fucking parallels to be made. Because Anastasia Steele knows that Christian Grey is dangerous, but she flirts with it anyway. And in like a very similar manner. Ooh, could fucking 50 Shades be read as like a 50s like nostalgia piece? Sorry, I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole right now and like just exploring how things, because like there are enough parallels in this that like obviously Blue Velvet came first, but like the influences are strange, right? Like,
right.
How do we end up at 50 Shades when Blue Velvet isn't super? It's incredibly different. It's good for one thing. Yeah, I don't know, man. Sorry, you can keep going. I don't even know if you remember what you're talking about, but no, please.
It's fine. It's fine. That's all to say that just like, I think that like if you wanted to emphasize the angle, not just the angle of like Kyle MacLachlan is a pervert because he's like, you know, getting himself involved with kinky shit, but more like, you know, there's maybe something, because the more sinister thing, like, to me, is less that Isabella Rossellini character's asked to hit her and he obliges. The more sinister thing is that like he's snooping on her into her apartment from the closet, like just watching her and like, you know, kind of like basically stalking her. Like it's under the guise of an investigation, but like that's the real like super predatory shit that he's doing.
Jackson, shut up! You're doing it again. God damn it! Because Christian Grey stalks Anastasia Steele. You know that? He does. Granted, it's a little bit inverted here. I mean, there's a lot of inversions here because obviously Anastasia is the one who eventually pulls him out. Like, all I'm saying is that there are some character connections to be made. It is by no means a perfect comparison because of how it all plays out. But yeah, I stand by my assessment, as weird as that is.
I mean, it's not everything you've been saying as an outsider. Like, it's all been tracking to me. So I think you're onto something here. But like that's just all to say. Like, I don't have really a grand thesis in that. Like, yes, there are a lot of like messy like power dynamics and abuse and like fetishes and politics, and that's all intentionally so. And our clean ending is like we're gonna end up with like happy stable girl next door at the end. Like, that does not feel like the right ending to this movie in the slightest to me.
I mean, it does in as far as like the 1950s aesthetic of it all, which is clearly what the movie is trying to deal with mostly. And so like I agree with you. I entirely do. I think that the ending is very weird, and also plays into the fact that him being saved into this idyllic lifestyle from the terrifying darkness of the S&M community is a lot. Granted, there is a lot more sexual assault involved in that. I keep like really doubling down and stuff and then kind of backtracking here just because so much of this movie is based around sexual assault that like
it's fraught territory. I think people understand that we're not trying to disparage anyone.
Exactly.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
So.
Like I apologize, but like it is one of those things where like it can be read that way. And I think the fact that it is sexual assault is more damning for different but parallel reasons.
And maybe to move away from that territory a little bit, but going along with, you know, the fact that we still kind of get our happy 50s ending, like the fact
our
that
happy 50s shades of gray.
50s.
There's another parallel to it, baby. See, this is why I'm saying you could read 50 Shades of Grey as a 50s movie, and like it's in the title.
My man, Professor Sean, he's gonna, you know, publish a documentary about this, you know, acclaimed for his work on 50 Shades, you know, the foremost scholar of our time.
Who is Pepe Sylvia? Who is Pepe Sylvia?
But with the other aspect of the ending, and that like I think going along with why the ending feels wrong to me is that like I do really like the final confrontation between Kyle MacLachlan and Dennis Hopper, and like, you know, sort of the tricks that he pulls, like just from a like tension standpoint, the scene's really great. The fact the movie ends with Kyle MacLachlan like blowing Dennis Hopper away in like an extremely like brain splatter gory fashion, yeah, like. Maybe I'm misremembering like the final shots of the movie, but like when I'm imagining something like that for an ending like that especially is about diving into like the seedy underbelly, I'm not imagining running away with the girl next door. I'm imagining like, you know, to bring it to my own memes, like Big Boss saluting at a grave and weeping. Like that's the sort of thing. Like I've like by taking this action, I have like,
hey, killing someone is traumatic. And wouldn't end with the man sitting in a chair while the robin munches on the underground bugs. That, you know, it's all symbolism. Love kills the underbelly. That doesn't make a lot of sense with everything else that we've seen so far. Now, does it? Yeah, the ending is fucking wild, and I don't fully understand it. I'm sure someone out there could make it make sense in a way that I would very much enjoy. And if you got a way that this ending does sound interesting and isn't just love conquers the seedy underbelly of suburbia, let's go back to our dreamlike reality, I'm very interested in hearing it. But as it is, that's nothing, man.
Yeah, no, for sure. And also, I mean, on a less like serious and a more memey note.
Wait. Before you do, I actually might have just come up with it.
All right, lay it on me.
Okay, so if we're supposed to, if we're going to read this as essentially Lynch's experience in the 1950s, or like indeed the 1950s as a whole, what this could be read as is like the 1950s are idyllic and perfect, except for when they're not. And like in those moments, we see that the 1950s are a nightmare hellscape of people doing bad things before they come back out. And we all remember that the 1950s is great again. It's kind of like an out of sight, out of mind thing going on with it. And so like this ending there where it all ends happily is like, okay, cool. That part of the news is over. Let's get back to puppy rescued from tree. Everything is great now again. So if you want to take it as like a microcosm of the 50s of just like, good guys always win, back to idolism, great. I think that there's a way that it could be read in that light that I think would make it a little bit more impactful. I don't know that the movie does enough to underscore that that is what it is going for, but I think that is absolutely an interpretation you could make of it.
I think that's really valid. I think that to go along with what you're saying and to use the Metal Gear Solid comparison, because I love fucking doing that. I think there's something to that idea that even if you have experience something really traumatic, that like some basic humanity or like connection can kind of like keep you grounded and like help. I think that's a valid message and a valid way of like looking at the world. I think that can be really resonant, and I think that's one of the reasons I love the first Metal Gear Solid so much. The whole game is basically about that. But I think, like you say, that the way the movie in front of me did not feel like it was leading me to that conclusion until it did. Does that make sense?
I mean, it absolutely does. I mean, I completely agree with you. clearly by what I've been saying, I just think that there is an interpretation of it that is a valid reading of it that I think would lend some more credence to what it's saying. But I agree that it does not present itself as such.
And while we're talking about the ending, just a fucking meme, were you, speaking of the Robin, were you cackling at the Muppet Robin?
The Muppet Robin was wonderful. I was honestly more kind of trying to figure out how they did it because it was clearly like a puppet, but they still had the bug legs moving. So I wasn't sure if they put like a living bug in that puppet or something.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was delighted, but it was just kind of jarring because the movie overall is like really slick, and it's like, I'll say a lot of things about that Robin, but it wasn't slick, so I don't know.
I mean, to be fair though, it is kind of like peak 1950s idealism. Like you think about like the Disney era with like fucking felt robins landing on shoulders and stuff. Yeah, in case you can't tell, that's a very half-hearted defense of it, but...
Yeah, and it's not like, me memeing on the Robin is like a big deal, but like I was just like, oh.
Yeah, no, for sure. It is very weird. I was just very transfixed by that bug and trying to figure out what the fuck it was, whether it was living or like some puppetry. So, call it.
I think we did it, Reddit.
All right. I've been Sean McKinda. Find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. I'm mostly tweeting about skateboard stuff right now. So, I mean... that's what you're into, come hang out. But also stick around because I talk about movies and video games and stuff like that. I'm also writing on 25yearslatersite.com sometimes if you want that.
And I've been Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter at Jackson J. Keller. I tweet about hogs, and that's about it. I post Rosie pics, though. She's a cute dog. I love Rosie. Everybody loves Rosie.
Can confirm, Rosie is a wonderful dog. If you want to follow the podcast, that's at BADH_cast on Twitter. We mostly tweet about like episode updates or if like we're on a break or something like that. I'll probably be tweeting out like, hey, if you want to listen to something, here's what you should be listening to for the next 2 weeks. So there's that. If you want to support us, the best place to do so is on Patreon. That's patreon.com/BADHcast. For only $1 a month gets you access to our Discord where you can yell at Jackson and I directly with unlimited character counts. $5 a month gets you access to that as well as a backlog of bonus episodes. We've got a ton of really good stuff. We got a new episode coming out tomorrow. Stay tuned for that. Neither one of us have any idea what the movie is about, so it should be a very interesting one. We also have a $10 tier which gets access to everything before and the ability to request movies if, like our requester, you want us to watch something weird that we haven't seen before. That's the way to do it. It also gets a little something something.
Thank you so much, Julia, Travis, Pat, Mom, Summer. Y'all are great. Go team. Hooray.
Also, thanks to Loads of High with the use of our theme song. It is Suicide alternate take off the album High Octane Low Expectations. They're a wonderful band. You should go check them out wherever you can. Support artists, theater people, whoever in the arts right now, especially. It is very hard for them, so please stream them, buy their music, whatever you got to do, support those people. Also, thanks to 25yearslatersite.com. We use a little button of us in the corner, but you can also go read some of the articles that are up there. A lot of people are doing some really, really talented writing, so go check that out. Next week, as we said, absolutely nothing. Week after that, also absolutely nothing. But the week after that, we're talking about animes again. It's going to be Parasite the Maxim, one of my all-time favorites. Stick around.
The best show with the worst theme song.
Oh my God. Oh God. We'll definitely be talking about that. Bye.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go